Welcome to the Indie Writer Podcast, where we talk all things writing and indie publishing. Today, Cari and I are excited to be talking about superheroes with authors Mike Chen and Matt Harry. Mike is the author of We Could Be Heroes, Here and Now and Then, and A Beginning at the End. He has contributed to Star Wars from a certain point of view and covered geek culture for sites such as Tor.com, The Mary Sue, and StarTrek.com. In previous lives, he has been a musician, DJ, aerospace engineer, and credentialed NHL reporter. Mike lives in the Bay Area with his wife, daughter, and rescue animals. Matt Harry is the author of Sorcery for Beginners and its sequel, Cryptozoology for Beginners, which Booklist called a clever, often hilarious adventure. He received an MFA in film production from USC's School of Cinematic Arts and has worked as a filmmaker, editor, screenwriter, college professor, movie critic, and story consultant. His work has received accolades from the Fox Comedy Script Contest, the Austin Film Festival, the Launchpad Manuscript Competition, and the Nicholl Fellowship. He lives in Los Angeles with his wife and 2 sons. Thanks so much for joining us today. How are you guys doing?
Good. Thanks for having us.
Thank you for having us.
How are you, Cari?
Good. Excited to talk about superheroes.
So to start, why don't you both just kind of give us an overview before we dive into the nitty-gritty about, the basis of what your stories are about. Mike, do you want to start?
Sure. So We Could Be Heroes is a story of a supervillain and a superhero who accidentally become friends. They meet up in an anonymous support group, and they discover that they have more in common than they realize. So rather than fight, they decide that they're going to team up and try to figure out how they got their powers together.
And how about you, Matt?
Yeah, Super Kid is, it comes out June 1st, and it's a middle grade book about a 13-year-old comic book fan named Robbie Rampino who is kind of upset when his dad gets remarried to this new woman, and then they have a baby, which makes things even worse. And one day he has to stay home and take care of the baby, and she's playing around on the floor, and suddenly he accidentally startles her, and she bounces off the ground by herself. And he realizes that his baby sister has a superpower. So he starts going around like any 13-year-old would and starts using her to fight crime and live out his superhero dreams. But that starts to become a problem when actual criminals get involved in the Department of Homeland Security, and his family discovers that her powers were actually engineered by somebody. So they have to go on an adventure together as a family to find out who did this to her and why.
Yeah, there's some similar themes between your book and Mike's book, which is kind of figuring out the origins of where these powers came from. So that's kind of neat. So both of you have written other genres before you wrote a superhero story. So tell us a little bit about that. Why did you decide to give writing a superhero story a try?
It wasn't my first thing I was leaning towards, for sure, because I had a huge awareness that there was oversaturated in the market. Mm-hmm. And the way I kind of approached it, it wasn't really a superhero story to begin with. I was thinking about my own son. I have a 5-year-old and a 10-year-old. And my 10-year-old is on the autism spectrum and has ADHD. And I was taking care of him one day when he was 4 and thinking to myself, like, I can barely control this 4-year-old, ball of energy, because he was just so energetic. This is before he was kind of diagnosed with anything. And we started figuring out ways to kind of deal with it. And I thought, like, how would this be more difficult? And then I started thinking about, like, the movie Superman, how when they find Superman and he's a baby, he lifts the car off of, like, his dad. And then they just cut to when Superman's 16. And I was like, you just skipped over the most difficult, dramatic part of the story. How do you survive raising Superman when he's a 3-year-old and he's throwing a tantrum? Or when he gets upset that you didn't give him applesauce instead of Oreo cookies and he turns on his laser eyes. So that was kind of where it started, was like looking at my own kid and kind of extrapolating out like how difficult this would be if you had a kid with superpowers. And so it actually went through a lot of changes. Originally it was a stay-at-home dad who finds out his daughter has superpowers. And I showed it to a friend of mine, and she was like, this feels bad that a father is using his daughter to go out and kind of become a superhero and fight crime. And I was like, you're right, that is bad. And so then I reconceived it as a middle grade novel. So it was kind of a long, lengthy process to kind of get to that. And I could talk more about, like, once I started realizing it was a real superhero book, what that approach was, because I then realized I had to decide, do you kind of lean into the whole thing of recognizing there's superheroes in the world, or do you do kind of the other thing that a lot of superhero novels do, which is act like they've never heard of the concept of superheroes before?
And how about you, Mike? How did you get into writing superhero fiction? Because I've only read one of your other books, but it was kind of more of a time travel series. So why did you make that switch?
So right after I published my first book, so there's two parts to this origin story. So the first part is like right after I published my first, or when we sold my first time travel book, I didn't want to be pigeonholed as like the time travel guy, because everyone started asking like, are you going to do more or a sequel or whatever? I'm like, I don't really want to do sequels, though I am open for it for We Could Be Heroes, because I really love those characters. But I kind of made this internal goal for myself of like, I kind of want to hit all of the subgenres in speculative fiction that I really love. So We Could Be Heroes was just kind of like on this dial of like, there's cyberpunk, there's time travel, there's superheroes. But the idea actually first came when I was on submission with Here and Now and Then. So my submission process, I was on submission for 20 months, which is a long, terrible time to have like your publishing fate out of your own control. And I went to acquisition basically every 3 to 4 months. I went to acquisition, and it wasn't a typical process at all. And because most of the time it's like you kind of have like 6 months and then you're just kind of done and you move on to the next project. But because this kept getting close, my agent was like, let's give it one more try. And in the middle of that, I was like kind of despondent. And so he had forwarded me some short fiction contests. And so We Could Be Heroes, the characters and the world originated as a short story called Anonymous, which is basically the 5th chapter of We Could Be Heroes, where the actual support group. It was a short story that was kind of built around that. And about 60 to 70% of that short story still exists in this book. And so I published that. I didn't put it in any contest, but I sold it to a magazine. And then when it came time, so Here and Now and Then published, and then A Beginning at the End published. And then it was time to think like, well, what am I going to do now? And I'm like, I really loved those characters. I had the world built already. So I asked my agent, like, would anyone actually buy a superhero novel? Because I'm like, this is, you just don't see too much of that in adult fiction. And the nice thing is I'm with Miro, which is a commercial fiction imprint of HarperCollins. And because they're not strictly science fiction and they're not strictly like literary fiction, they're actually letting me bounce around different subgenres, and they're very supportive of that, as long as I stay with like a character driven story. So I was still kind of surprised when they bought off on it, but I think it seems to be a good time. There's actually a few superhero novels like that have come out now or are coming out soon, so I think I managed to beat the zeitgeist just by a little bit.
That's cool. I feel like you both do a really good job too of just creating these superhero stories where all the relationships are platonic, which obviously Matt, yours is middle grade, so it's a little different. But, I just really loved the friendship between your characters, Mike, and how, it was their bonds of friendship that kind of got them through. There wasn't really a romantic thread to that at all. And that was neat to see. That was refreshing.
Yeah.
I like that a lot too.
That was really important to me. Like, that was one of the first things that I wanted to work with. I wanted to write a friendship book, and I just feel like there's not a lot of that as like a B plot, to most adult novels. It's almost, not always, but like probably 50 to 60% of adult novels, like the romance is the B plot. And if it's not a romance, it might be like a family story or whatever, but like just a pure friendship story, like that doesn't really happen that much. And I think like I really wanted to give that some representation, because I feel like we don't honor that enough, especially like copy editing this in the middle of 2020 when I was missing all of my friends and everything. I think like, you really learn to value that more after going through a freaking pandemic together. So yeah, that was one of the things that I really wanted to shoot for when I first drafted this.
To jump off what Mike was saying, that was something I really enjoyed about Falcon and the Winter Soldier, was that, and I think what Marvel's been doing with its TV shows in general, that they can kind of take these superhero conceit and do different kinds of stories with it. Like, I love the buddy kind of almost cop story that they were telling. That was my favorite parts of that. It's almost a shame and I loved WandaVision too, how WandaVision could be like a Lost type mystery show. And then it's almost a shame when they have to go back to the superhero stuff and they have to have like a big fight at the end or make a speech about being a hero, because I think it's cool to explore those different relationships. And we've done so many superhero stories at this point. Like, why not? Why not explore these different types of stories within that? So I think, to go what you were saying, Jackie, off of mine, again, the relationship evolved. It was interesting once you had like an older brother, a much older brother. He's 13 and his sister is like under a year. To look at that idea of kind of like, what if Robin was the caretaker of Batman? It kind of inverted that traditional relationship of like the person with no powers is actually the one who has the responsibility and who's the one in charge, because she's just a baby. And so it brought this interesting, all these things kind of came up out of it about like, what does it mean to be an older brother? What does it mean to be in a family and have responsibility for someone who's younger than you? And as I was working on it, I was seeing my 10-year-old go through that with my 5-year-old, because they have quite a big gap, and him having to learn what it means that like you have to go out and kind of protect him. He doesn't always want to do that, and it's a hassle. And so pulling a lot of that stuff in, I think it was just a different thing that I haven't seen a lot in superhero stories in particular.
Well, that's kind of a good segue to another question that I had, which is, as you're writing these, I'm sure that there are certain superhero tropes that you're excited to play with because they're fun. And then there's others that you intentionally try to avoid, maybe because they've been overdone, or, maybe they uphold harmful stereotypes. And so how do you decide, which tropes to just embrace as part of the genre and which ones to distance yourself from? And then how do you invent your story so that it's still within, the superhero lane?
Go ahead, Mike.
So one thing that I had to consider with was that because I'm going through an adult commercial fiction imprint, my audience probably will not be people who, like, maybe they'll watch Marvel movies or maybe they'll watch like a DC TV show, but they probably don't know like deep lore like within comic continuity. So what I tried to do when I was giving Jamie and Zoe their powers, I tried to kind of use a shorthand of like, one's going to be a mental power, one of them's going to be a physical power. A lot of the stuff that they can do is like, if you just think like superhero, supervillain, what are they going to be able to do? Like, they kind of fall into like that sphere. Like, there's not a lot of like, they can, I don't know, open up interdimensional portals, or, it's a little bit more down the middle with them. And so I wanted to be able to use a shorthand that didn't require a lot of explanation for the audience. And then from there, I just wanted to take what I consider to be pretty standard superhero tropes, but then like really ground them in reality about like, okay, well, these people can do these things, but like, how do they feel about them? Are they happy about it? They still have to pay rent somehow. They still have to work, and because it's not like they're generating their own food or their own shelter or whatever. So trying to ground that in a sort of reality. So it was taking tropes that I really love, but then turning them on their side and then placing them within a world that we could recognize.
And I would say for me, again, I made a decision early on. I wanted to reference the fact that superheroes exist, that this is in our world where people know about Superman, Spider-Man, Green Lantern. Our main character is a huge comic book movie fan. He's seen all these movies. So I wanted to specifically go at the tropes of these and deal with them with, how would this actually happen in reality if you were dealing with a baby and a 13-year-old in charge of it? So, because I feel like if someone actually were to get superpowers nowadays, there is a lot of like material you could use to kind of educate yourself about what am I supposed to do and what's not good to do and all this stuff. So for every kind of aspect, as they're trying to figure out how to be superheroes, I tried to interrogate and lean into, from a kid's perspective, like, why do these things exist? Like, why the skin tight suit? Like, there's a scene where they order a bunch of superhero costumes online. He's trying stuff on and he's like, why is it skin tight? Like, I hate the way this makes me look. Can I just wear like some jeans and a jacket? And so I tried to play with that aspect of it. And then there were certain things, like, I feel like, because I'm writing a comedy adventure for kids, I feel like you have to have action scenes. but I tried to make them action scenes that, again, flipped on their head a little bit. So there's a scene where they're in a car chase and they're commenting about the fact that they're in a car chase. And the dad, who's like a film professor, is like saying, like, I've analyzed these for scene study class, but I've never like one. This is crazy. So it's that kind of thing where they're acknowledging that they've seen this kind of thing before, and how they're actually dealing with reality is a little bit more awkward or a little bit more stressful or dangerous or kind of not what you expect from seeing in a movie or a comic book, which I feel like gets glossed over in the movies. You know, like someone gets knocked into a wall and they just like get up and don't even have a bruise. You know, like Captain America has like one little bruise on him after getting hit with a building. And so this, I tried to be a little bit more realistic and funny at the same time about it.
The skin tight suits made me laugh because this is a tangent, but we were just watching that one Star Trek episode where Deanna and Beverly are working out in the holodeck, and they have like these goofy outfits on. And my husband and I were watching it, and we were like, why does everyone have to wear a jumpsuit? Like, how do they go to the bathroom? And I imagine this is similar for superheroes. Like, why does it have to be a jumpsuit? So I look forward to reading that scene.
Can you give us a hint, Matt, of what you discovered in your research?
Well, I mean, again, like when I had the babies, is like, and he's carrying his baby sister in like an ergo. So he's got her strapped to his chest. And because he's like a caretaker of a small baby, he realizes there are certain things that come in handy, like a utility belt with snacks and a squeezy toy and extra formula for when she gets hungry. But, you know, there's like a scene in it where they do this big action scene. And at the end of it, he's like, we got to pull over. Like, Super Kid just had a super blowout and they've got to change your diaper. Because anyone who's been a parent has realized, like, that's your life. Your life is on the clock of the kid. And no matter what you're doing, the kid is going to suddenly go to the bathroom or suddenly have a meltdown. Like, there's a scene where they're going off to have one of their first big encounters, and they literally can't get the kid inside the car because the kid doesn't want to go in the car seat. So it's like a 15-minute delay of them trying to go off and, you know, be superheroes for the first time.
Because we used to call that limp baby when they would like go, you know, stiff, and then you couldn't get them into the car seats.
Yeah, I felt like I haven't read the whole thing yet, Matt, but I read the first few chapters, and I felt like you set that up really well in that it starts with a scene of the brother and the baby on a bridge, and he's got like the bottles in the utility belt and the pacifier, and you're just like, okay, where is this gonna go? And so I think you did a really great job with that. And Mike, do you want to speak to that? I know that you had Zoe piece together her suit. And so what was that process like, figuring out, okay, how are these outfits going to work, or how are my characters going to respond to this? What did that look like for you?
So yeah, I try to think about the reality of it, because the suits they're all really ridiculous, and I love how in the DC shows on CW, like Arrow and the Flash, like they address that about like, where are you making these suits and like why do you have them? And so for Zoe, I try to make hers like, she talks about how she uses her superpowers. Her day job is to deliver fast food. So she's basically like a door dasher, except she just runs because she's faster that way. But she found that like she would be tearing her pants, like because she'd just be running so fast that like things would split at the seams. And so she found some discarded motorcycle gear behind a motorcycle shop, and she just kind of pieced together this suit that splits into 5 pieces. So it's kind of stitched together, and but it's much more practical for her. So like I wanted to, when I was trying to give her a reason for having the suit, like I just wanted it to make sense in the real world, because it couldn't just be that, you know, she just found a magic suit somewhere. Like that doesn't work in the reality of what of how these characters live. And then Jamie's, his suit is really just like a hoodie and a scarf and an eye mask, and he acknowledges that they are all props, because his whole thing is that he wants to put on a persona. So when he robs a bank, everyone's terrified of him, and the idea is that the more scared people are, the less they're going to try to interfere, and then he can just get in and out and not hurt anyone. And all he does is steal from the banks, and the banks are insured by the FDIC, so no one gets hurt. He's looking at like zero loss excursion for his bank robbery. So his is all about theatrics, and he's playing off of these tropes that he's seen before in like the literary and pop culture world, trying to identify their points of view of like what are they actually going through, and what's like the practical needs of them assembling their suits.
So, Cari, do you want to do a couple of the audience Q&A questions?
Yeah, sure.
Several today.
And I have a question of my own. Oh, but somebody else also mentioned it. So maybe I should go to this one that is both from the audience. I wanted to talk about villains because I was thinking about in Mike's book how Jamie, right? His name is Jamie?
Mm-hmm.
I read it like 6 months ago, so pardon me if I forget some of the details. But he kind of starts out as like, ooh, the villain. But then you quickly find out that, you're getting into his head and he's really one of the protagonists. But then a new villain emerges. And just kind of playing off that, what is a villain? Who is a villain? How do you set up the conflict? And then our audience question has also asked, what is taboo these days, and what is a way to set yourself up to break ground and do something different? So kind of a couple questions there.
So with establishing Jamie, like the original version of this, you learn that he's not a villain like within the first paragraph. Like what he's doing, like he's robbing a bank, but like you get into his head right away as he's like kind of going through his speech and like his his preparations for it. And my editor said, like, let's pull back on that. Let's let him be a villain for like a page and a half, and then things start to go wrong, because that'll probably be a little more funny to peel back the layers in there, because as he's performing this, he has to really believe it to try to pull it off. But we wanted to nail right away that like when you're grounded in reality, it's like there are very few people who are like really just like maniacal laughing evil villains. So what's going on in their heads? And that's what I really wanted to do with him, to show that like, hey, he's a really good cat owner, and he returns his library books on time, and like those are really important things. And they're key parts of his character that show that he's in so many ways he's a lawful good person. He just couldn't figure out a better way to earn a living and retire with his cat on a Caribbean island. That's all he wants to do. It was just about trying to get into his head and show that like even though he's doing these things that are technically illegal, he's going out of his way to prepare for it, to make sure no one gets hurt, and to put on like this persona that kind of exists around his goals. And then the true protagonist, who gets revealed about halfway in, I mean, she is a little bit more like comic book tropey, but I really wanted to give her a purpose that felt like altruistic and personal, so that even though you can see that she's kind of inspired by a lot of like comic book villains, I think the best comic book villains are the ones where you can, like, Magneto is probably my personal favorite, and you totally get why Magneto does what he does. And so I wanted someone along those lines who had a purpose to what she's doing, and then that's infused within like a personal vendetta type of thing. So that's where they come from. Like everything is grounded in reality, so that they're not just like a two-dimensional cartoon.
For me, the villain was a little trickier because I knew I wanted it to be a reveal. It was kind of like the classic secret villain, like who is the puppet master kind of pulling the strings. So that was, I always think like if you're going to do that, you need to have something that is an antagonistic force happening throughout. And again, what I kind of realized was that since the main character is not the one with superpowers, it's actually his baby sister is the main antagonist. She's the one with the powers, but she's a baby. She doesn't know what she's doing. So the main character, Robbie, wants to be a superhero, but his sister is the one that gets in the way all the time because she's got to take a nap, or she's got to go to the bathroom, or she's got to... And I realized as I was writing it, this is probably like a thinly veiled metaphor for, parenthood that that I was going through, the change that you go through in life. So I feel like there's really three antagonists in my book. There's the baby who doesn't want to do any of the stuff that Robbie wants her to do to be a superhero. And there's Robbie himself, who has to grow up and realize just because my sister has this power doesn't mean I can use it however I want. I have to actually protect her and be responsible for her. And then there was a third villain, which is the more tropey kind of superhero villain that doesn't get revealed till really towards the end of the book. But then even that, once I do the reveal, I tried to make it something that was more relatable to like a middle grade audience. So it's not just like, some scary dude in a helmet. It's something that has hopefully more of an emotional punch when it lands.
I imagine writing for middle grade is really hard. I never even considered it. So props to you for doing that and spinning that, that original metaphor of parenthood kind of on its side and making it relatable to that audience. Speaking of children, mine are coming up the stairs. So Jackie, would you like to read the next question?
All right, so this is a big one here. So totally not Bex, who is actually Becca Spence-Tobias, which is another one of our hosts, asked, so many superheroes are entwined with American nationalism. Do you think about how you're countering this in your stories?
You can make statements about diversity in two ways. You can write a story about an issue, which I cannot do. And I have some friends who excel at it, and they write beautiful allegories that really tackle hard issues head on, and like they don't make you feel preached to. I could not pull that off. So the flip side of that, I think it's really important to write normalization stories where you just see characters exist, characters of diversity exist. And so for me, it was really important to have an Asian American superhero, and so she's just there. She's a badass, and she's a total disaster at the same time. And Asian Americans were not really allowed to be that. So it was really important for the person who's more screwed up in life to be Asian, to just give that sort of like external outside of the norms for her. And Jamie, this is a very minor plot point, but Jamie is pansexual, and so there's reference about his past life, like before his memories get walled off, like you find out more about what his personal relationships were before that. And there's also a very specific moment where he looks at Zoe, like after they've become friends, and like he kind of considers like what is their relationship, and he's like, no, we're friends, it's good. And I wanted that to be really, really specific, and that came from I have a friend who is pansexual, and he was just talking about how he's like, I've never seen myself anywhere in anything, and I'm like, I want to change that for you, so let me just make this, because it's not consequential to the story at all. Like it could be done other ways, but like that's the kind of, I think, normalization that's really important, that like you want these things to just exist. Actually, one of my examples I always cite of this when I talk on diversity panels is actually from The Flash on CW. In the first season of The Flash, so this is like 2013, 2014-ish, when like we talked about diversity, but like probably not as much as we do now. And there was just a throwaway line where the police captain, his name is Captain Singh, so he's clearly Indian American, and he says, oh, my husband's going to kill me for working late again. And so it's like within that one line, you have an Asian American in a position of power referencing his legally married husband, and they are in a stable, healthy relationship in one line. And that's the kind of normalization that I'm trying to bring into my stories. I just try to write what I want to see.
Another thing that I noticed about your stories, which when I'm kind of ruminating on Becca's question, is that there's so many, just force-driven storylines. The we're punching the hardest, we're stomping the strongest, and that is how we get out of this debacle. And you did not write your story like that. I don't want to give any spoilers or anything, but kind of the way that they ultimately defeat the villain is not necessarily a show of force. And I think that was a really cool way to work through that story as well.
And I like how modern superhero media has started to realize that like you don't always have to go there, that like emotional connections or just creative problem solving can give you other means of defeating the big bad or solving the big problem. But I think like if I wrote something that was ended with purely an action sequence rather than problem solving in a way, like I wouldn't be able to pull it off that well. It's like that just doesn't feel natural to me.
I've noticed, Mike, in your books that when you include an action scene, like it always has a purpose, and obviously that's how writing's supposed to work. But sometimes in these Marvel movies, I'm just like, why are they doing this? Why is this important? And I like that you use it to move the story forward. And I recall from Matt's writing too that that's similar, and I imagine it's the same in Super Kid. But I like, with both of you, I like how intentional your stories are and how the characters work together with the plot to create the story.
Yeah, I mean, I love action scenes in movies, but I feel like if they aren't driven by character and story and emotion, they really are empty and meaningless. And you can look at there's very successful franchises, I won't name names, but that are all about the action set pieces. But I don't really watch them because it just doesn't hook me in. But if it's something like, the lightsaber fight between Darth Vader and Luke Skywalker in Empire Strikes Back, that's like thrilling to me because it's really, the fight scene is an extension of this thing that they can't figure out through only words, which is, I've got something to tell you. I abandoned you when I was a kid and I'm your dad. And Luke not wanting to believe that. And it's such a big emotional issue. They have to throw things at each other with their mind and have lightsaber fights to kind of get to it. And I think I try to do the same thing in Super Kid. I know that's it's very much part of the genre, and you kind of, particularly for the audience I'm writing for, you have to kind of include that fun stuff. But I did try to make sure that each one was an extension of something that was kind of happening in the story at that point, some kind of obstacle that they had to overcome. And the very ending, like you, Mike, I was thinking about, I just don't want this to be the world is ending, a city's flying through the sky, because it just starts to become so big, it means nothing. So I literally boiled it down to the whole climax takes place on a parking lot outside a big play place. And it's really between just a couple of people, and what they're talking about is kind of family responsibility. And so hopefully that's more engaging, than the big kind of spectacle.
Yeah, for sure. I think adding just that nuance in there and kind of, turning those things on their head and making sure that the character drives it. I mean, I love writing action as much as the next person. My books definitely have that in there. But just making sure that there's also a problem-solving element rather than just, I'm going to crush you is always a nice welcome change. So, audience question. What superheroes inspired you to become a fan of the genre or take a crack at writing your own? Were there any elements of favorite superheroes that you reconstructed and recontextualized them into your own stories?
I was always a fan of Spider-Man. That was the superhero I always related to the most because he's got these great powers, but he's basically a broke teenager who can't get to class on time. Like you said earlier, Mike, he can't hold down a job because he's always off fighting crime, but he doesn't have billions of dollars like Iron Man or Batman. He doesn't have he's not, I think, emotionally kind of invincible the way other people are. Superman doesn't need the job at the Daily Bugle. He could be fine. He could find a way to exist. But Spider-Man needs that job. He takes pictures of himself. He's the original selfie guy before selfies existed. He with the webs up in the corner and his camera in it. And I just love the way, too, he approaches it he was fun. He wasn't brooding like Batman. He wasn't kind of, an alcoholic like Tony Stark. He's not this impossible Boy Scout like Captain America and Superman. He's a relatable, regular dude who's in the middle of a fight. He's man, this is crazy. You've got 8 arms. And I was that's the kind of thing I feel I would be doing, is making those kinds of comments in the middle of it. And I really love how, the new Marvel Spider-Man, the third time's the charm. I think they really captured that energy with Tom Holland. He's in the middle of a fight and he's wow, you got a super suit. That's awesome. I think that energy is great.
Yeah. And Mike, I noticed you use a lot of that in your story too. Even in the midst of action, you kind of have that self-deprecating humor coming out through Zoe and just some of that kind of icebreakers through your scene. And that's really neat. So were there elements of favorite superheroes for you that helped shape your story?
Yeah, my my favorite childhood superheroes were definitely like on the other end of the spectrum, because I read a lot of like the Punisher and classic X-Men, and those would not fit in with my characters at all. But one of my favorite shows on like of the past 10 years is DC's Legends of Tomorrow, which is just like, it doesn't quite get as much attention as like The Flash or like Arrow or like the other DC TV shows, but it's so ridiculous, and the characters understand that it's ridiculous, and they're all kind of disasters themselves in a way. They're the self-acknowledged B team of the DC universe, and they always screw up, and they just kind of somehow manage to fix things. And so, like, the internal bar for Jamie and Zoe was like, could they fit in with the Legends of Tomorrow with what they're doing? And as long as I could meet that sort of internal criteria, I felt like it was doing justice to the story that I wanted to do.
That just reminds me of those guys that were stuck in the void in the Teen Titans Go movie, which I've seen like 800 times. Like, what were they called? I can't remember.
I don't
those
remember.
Guys...
I saw that. I saw that once. My daughter's like right below the age where it's like that humor is appropriate. So
yeah,
I haven't
fair.
seen it again.
My kids are super, super into it. But
that is my favorite version of Robin, though.
And yeah, I was going to say, too, that you guys mentioned WandaVision earlier, and my kids were yakking when you were talking, so I couldn't jump in. But I absolutely love that show, too, and I love Scarlet Witch. I had no idea of all of the lore behind her. And my kids also really, even though it probably is a little higher than their age range, like I'm not sure they definitely didn't get the TV references, but they really enjoyed that, too.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it took me so long. It's probably one of the only Marvel shows where I was just actually researching who exactly everyone was, and how do I know Quicksilver, and how do I know, okay, Monica is, and just piecing it all together, which, although I've always loved superhero stories and I've loved Marvel, that was probably the first story that got me like, okay, I need to connect all the dots right this minute.
Yeah.
With WandaVision,
that's
it's
awesome.
one of the things that Matt had brought up earlier about like my only critique of WandaVision was like at the end, I thought like they had set up such a cool premise and format for the show, and then like the last episode has like a 20-minute intermission where it's just like typical Marvel fighting. We're up in the sky and we're punching each other and there's red rays blasting everywhere, and like I get why they did that, like this is their audience, but I think as creators, you know, Matt and I, like we control our own little world with words, so it's much easier to like, we can just do whatever we want with it. But I really do like how WandaVision, for like 95% of it, was just like, we're going to destroy all expectations and we're going to write something that's extremely character based and do things that you've never tried before with like a comic book property. And I thought they really succeeded. I love the character work in there.
To have a giant billion-dollar superhero franchise have 2 episodes fully in black and white without really giving you any hint of what was going on, I was like, that is gutsy. That's a gutsy, bold move. And yeah, it's interesting that it's kind of doing the thing that Pixar can kind of do sometimes, which is it's got all these meta references and jokes to all the TV shows that you recognize, but then, like you saying, Cari, that your kids could watch it without that, it can do both, which I think is, again, ideal. That's always my hope, even though like I've written 3 books for kids now. My hope is that like an adult, if they picked it up, could read it and be entertained and get something out of it. I never believe in like dumbing things down for kids, because I think kids are really smart and they read up. And I mean, when I was 10, I read up. You know, I was like, you know, picking up books that probably I shouldn't have been picking up, and my parents had no idea I was reading. But I think they can handle a lot. You know, obviously I don't include R-rated stuff, but thematically I think they're pretty smart about what's going on and can go with it.
And I think with books often, at least I've seen with my son, who is 11 and a half, and we both read Sorcery series and loved it, Matt, so I think you're good. You've got that cross appeal, is that he'll put something down if he's not ready for it. Like, he's not gonna spend too much time with a book if it's not catching him. And so if it's a little too adult or it's making him uncomfortable, he'll put it down.
I always put stuff down if I don't like it. It's like life's too short for a book that's not your cup of tea. And it doesn't mean that it's not someone else's cup of tea. Books are very personal to each reader. But I think, I agree with you too, Jackie, that Matt's books are really accessible to any reader. I totally lost my train of thought here.
I wanted to be able to connect with, I read Anne Rice when I was 12. I read all of the Vampire Chronicles, and I read all sorts of very graphically violent comic books and stuff. So it's I wanted to create a world that just felt like anyone who enjoys Marvel or DC or whatever, they could just jump in with it and not necessarily be worried that it's going to get too dark or too creepy or anything like that.
Well, Mike, I remember correctly, is your next book about vampires? So that might be a good segue if you're allowed to talk about it.
My next book is is about alien abduction, and then the one after that is about vampires.
So we're still gonna have to.
You
wait
really are hitting all the spec fiction.
Yes, I am.
I love that. I even wrote that down when you said that. I'm like, maybe that should be my life goal too.
I want to see the dial you have in your house, Mike, with all the subgenres on it that you can, because I feel like that would be I'd like to see that.
Life goals.
For sure. Well, before we jump into plugs and everything, we always try to just ask, since it's an indie writer podcast, were there any resources or craft books or anything like that helped you in this process of writing your first superhero novel, or even just any resources that you turn to regularly as a writer that you would like to mention?
In the past year, so I guess the final edit and copy edits for this book, and then the main drafting for my upcoming alien abduction story, I had started doing sprints of 15 to 30 minutes, and I have a few friends who are out of genre from me. So it's we talk about the industry and the publishing journey together, but our books have zero overlapping audience. But we keep each other honest with I did 900 words today. I'm going to jump in and I'm going to edit right now. And it's purely of we're in a pandemic. 2 of the 3 of us have children. We have day jobs. We have no support at all. So it was a new way for me to try to get to the finish line, and I'd never done it before. I had always been at least 1 hour sessions, sometimes hopefully 3 hours or so. But I think I'm much more versatile now, and so I think that's definitely going to be a tool as hopefully the world starts reverting a little bit more to normal and childcare becomes available again. I'm definitely going to still try to employ that to get in quick hits here and there.
Yeah, and I found a similar thing in the last 14, 15 months. We lost all our childcare in March of last year, and the kids were doing distance learning from home. And I had to get in, I try to write 5 days a week, at least, 1,500 words a day when I'm drafting. I always try and be doing that at some point. And after the first couple of weeks, I realized, I can't do it in the house. It's too distracting. I can't go to a coffee shop because all those are closed. So I took my then 4-year-old and I would drive around for 20 minutes until he hopefully fell asleep, and then just pull over to the side of the road and start, writing while he was in his nap. And it was literally writing with a gun to your head. Because, if he wakes up and starts firing questions at me or says he has to go potty or ask for, a snack, it's it'll be tough to get back into it. But there were days he didn't take a nap, and I had to convince him, you do your work, I'm going to do my work. And I would sit in the front seat, and every 5 minutes he'd be like, now how many more minutes? Now how many more minutes? And I felt again, to go back to Star Wars, Luke on Dagobah with Yoda on his shoulder saying, use the Force, do it. And I feel if I could get through that, it made me realize, Mike was saying, I can write in kind of any situation now. I don't have to have my nice desk and nice quiet and a perfect mug of tea. It's I don't have to be alone. I could kind of do it anywhere.
That is probably the most intense of the writing during the pandemic stories that I've heard. So good job, Matt.
And I want to give you guys a chance to let everyone know how to keep up with you and where to find you and what you're working on next. So, Mike, do you want to go first?
Sure. I'm mostly active on Twitter, and that's at Mike Chen Writer. You have to make sure it's not the other Mike Chen with 3 million followers. He is a YouTube food guy. Sometimes I get his fan mail, and he has occasionally gotten mine too. So we've talked and joked about how we should do a Mike Chen podcast. So that's where I'm most active. My website is mikechenbooks.com, and I only update that like once a year. I really need to do that more. And that's basically where you can find me. My next book, which is going into copy edits right now, is called Light Years from Home, and it's inspired by the X-Files and the Haunting of Hill House series on Netflix. It's about a family that sees one of their children get abducted by aliens, and it causes them all to fracture. And then 15 years later, the son returns, having claimed to have been fighting in an intergalactic war for all that time. And they have to figure out, is he lying? Is he have mental illness? And what has happened to their family relations in between?
I notice a theme with your stories of whether it's superhero or time travel, but it's always like kind of a missing puzzle piece part to it.
I realize now, I've hitting a lot of like repeated themes of like identity and memory and family and stuff. I'm like, oh no, like every time it's there, and it's like, okay, well, I guess that's just who I am.
I don't think that's an oh no. I think it's cool to show how you can use those similar themes in various genres. That's neat.
As long as no one gets sick of it.
It just means you're an auteur. I mean, look at like Spielberg and Scorsese. They've, done dozens of movies. They're all about the same thing every time, but they're interesting, every time.
I'll take it.
Yeah. So, and I would say I like Instagram the best, but I'm on all the stuff. On Instagram, I'm at Matt_Harry_MH, and I'm on Twitter at MattHarryMH as well. I like the picture aspect of Instagram. It's a little more gentle than I think Twitter can be sometimes. But I'm on Facebook as well. So I'm currently on submission for this pandemic dystopian detective novel called Ashland. So we'll see what's going on with that. And then I'm drafting something that's totally different. It's actually an adult choose-your-own-adventure style book in something that I'm hoping is kind of a different type of choose-your-own-adventure style thing than we've seen before. So that's going to be something very different as well, and I'm hoping to finish the first draft of that by the end of the month.
Cool. Well, thank you both for coming. This was so fun.
Yeah, very excited to read more.
Thanks for listening to the Indie Writer Podcast. Today, I wanted to let all of our listeners know that we recently launched a Patron account through Podbean, where you can become a monthly subscriber for as little as $5 a month. Perks for indie authors include having your name and book link listed in our episode show notes and on-air shoutouts. For the first 20 people to subscribe at the $10 or $20 level, we will also place your book link or creator website in the show notes for all previously published episodes. Once we reach our third goal, we will transition from episodes every other week to episodes each week. So if you want more of the Indie Writer Podcast and our wonderful guests, then please head over to indiewriterpodcast.podbean.com and click Become a Patron. We appreciate all of you, and we want to thank the indie author and writing block communities for the continued support. You can find us on Twitter, Instagram, or Facebook, or at writingblock.com, no K. Remember to subscribe, share, and tell your friends. Thanks, everyone, and happy writing!